Good evening. It's Glenn McKnight, and I have a special guest tonight, Tracey Hackshaw and Maureen Hilyard. Thank you both for joining us today. Their topic today is because they're both members of the IGF Dynamic Coalition on Small Island Development States in the Internet Economy. We'll talk about economic issues as associated with our module with our School of Internet Governance. So I welcome you both, and over to you, Maureen.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for that introduction. And my name is Maureen Hilyard, and I'm here with my colleague, Tracey Hackshaw, to introduce you to our dynamic coalition of small island developing states in the internet economy. The title is a bit of a mouthful, but we're looking at, within our group, at how we as small island nations use the internet as a resource that can help us access the products and services that will meet our individual as well as collective needs in order to live and operate within our own small island economies. And when I'm talking about small island countries, even the difference between mine and Tracey's is quite diverse. For example, on the previous slide, the title slide, is my island of Rarotonga, which is the largest of 15 islands in the Cook Islands that are scattered over 2.5 million square kilometres of ocean. And as you could see in the photograph, it's pretty isolated. But moving to this current slide, and I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes to give you an idea of what our small island nation is about. As I mentioned, there are 15 islands, and they're basically located in northern and southern groups within 2.2 million square kilometres of ocean, which is our exclusive economic zone. And much of it is a large marine park, which we call Marae Moana, in which there is a huge interest in mining for nodules on its seabed, something that, we're still investigating. Our population, according to UN estimates for June 10, 2021, was 17,579, which is a little lower than the estimate for Trinidad and Tobago at 1.4 million. And the smallest island is Palmerston, which has about 50 people on it from one family who are English speakers. And the largest is Rarotonga with about 9,000 residents and currently about 2,000 tourists now that we've opened up our borders. But tourism is our money spinner in the Cook Islands, which gives us a GDP of about 355 million US dollars per annum. Whereas Trinidad and Tobago, as this is taken from Google Access, Tracey, has natural resources that give them an annual return of $24,000 million. A big difference. But our gross domestic product at 355 million, when estimated per capita, works out about 20,000, whereas for Trinidad and Tobago, this is slightly less because their population is a lot bigger, even though their annual return is much, much larger. However, in the Cook Islands, most of the large hotels and big businesses on the islands have overseas owners who take much of that profit back to their own countries, so that money isn't being spent in our country. And so the GDP seems a little bit misleading when it comes to judging the wealth of the country. Nevertheless, because of our GDP per capita rating, the OECD raised us into the next higher category of developing states, which means that we do not have access to as much aid as we used to get to assist with developing projects. And a really relevant example is to support the building of infrastructure to connect the fibre cable, which arrived on the island of Rarotonga in January of 2020 and has not yet been connected to any homes on the island. But to give them their due, because of the pandemic, the government has used most of its reserves to support businesses and communities during the nearly 15 months of closure of our border, so that we've had no income from tourists who have been our lifeblood. And the opening of our borders a few weeks ago is hopefully going to turn that around. But like, it's going to be a long time before we can make up the deficit. So next slide, please. So my job is to basically tell you what we're going to be doing in this particular program, now that I sort of like hijacked it initially. But it's really to introduce you to DC SIDS and what the internet economy means for SIDS. And Tracey's going to be giving you a rundown on an historical perspective of our dynamic coalition, as well as why we think it's really important that we did actually form this. And then we'll both go into looking at our own regions and how we're sort of like developing economies in the Pacific and Caribbean regions. And then Tracey will end with some objectives for our regional DC SIDS for 2021 to 2022. And any questions that people might have at the end that Glenn might be able to send us. So over to you, Tracey. Next slide.
Thank you, Maureen. And it was actually interesting to look at Trinidad and Tobago being compared to the Cook Islands, because I've actually never seen that done before. That's a very interesting comparison. And it's very, I think, very important for students of this school to understand that, like with countries generally, every territory or country is quite different. There are certainly similarities. There are certainly things that link us together, even across the oceans. But of course, there are many differences. And that's very important. And small and developing states are, in fact, very different from each other. But by and large, they share a lot of commonalities. So that's quite important. And it's if you're interested in small and developing states, I think it's something that you may want to, take away from this session and take a look at it. It's a very interesting topic, generally speaking, even beyond the internet and the internet governance space. So as Maureen said, well, on this slide, as you can see, we give ourselves a quick introduction. So I am Tracey Hackshaw. I'm speaking, and I'm a guy. So in case that name may have thrown some of you. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, as Maureen said, which is in the Caribbean. Maureen's from the Pacific, and we're literally on opposite sides of the world, quite literally speaking. Right now, as we're doing this presentation, I think it's about maybe 12 or more hours ahead of Maureen, as an example. And we're literally working, whenever we do this together, we're operating at different times. It's another challenge for Pacific and Caribbean states, depending on what side of the world you look at. Both Maureen and I have founded the Dynamic Coalition on Small and Developing States, and I'll speak about that quickly in a second, but just after we introduce ourselves. I'm also the chair-elect of what is called the Trinidad and Tobago Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, which is a group that works alongside the .tt country code top-level domain. I'm sure as students you would have learned about that in some of your sessions. And we also are a representative group for internet-based issues in Trinidad and Tobago. We have a lot of individuals who are actually from government or from the private sector, from academia, technical community, and civil society on our group. And on the board, I'm the chair-elect of that board. And we also organize the Internet Governance Forum, the TTIGF, every year. I'm also director of FinTech Association in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm the immediate past chair of the Internet Society Trinidad and Tobago chapter, whereas Maureen, as you can see, is a co-founder of the DC SIDS, and I'll explain how this happened, how we've worked together on this. She's currently the chair of the At-Large Advisory Committee, or the ALAC, of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN. She's also the board chair of .Asia organization, which is .Asia, huge top level domain, so really into the internet governance space, covering the entire Asia area. She's also a member of the Public Internet Registry Board, yes.
Advisory Council.
Advisory Council, and the PIR, which is Public Internet Registry DNS Abuse Institute Advisory Council. And she's also, like myself, a former chair of an Internet Society chapter, the Pacific Islands chapter, which is not a country, but actually, very impressively, all of the Pacific Islands. So what is going on here? What is this DC SIDS thing? So as you can see in this history here, which is one item that Maureen and I met, well, it's not 2010. We met before that actually at an IGF. I think if Maureen remembers, maybe she would have lost her luggage. I think when we first met and she was at a computer at a hotel, in a hotel lobby.
Egypt.
That's right, in Sharm el-Sheikh. And she was quite stressed out, having just arrived from a very far place and having lost her luggage. And we met, and we were both IGF ambassadors of Internet Society in 2009, I believe. And we formed a bond, you know, and we've been friends. I don't know how to call it, friends ever since. You know, we formed a mutual connection, and this small and developing state bond that we also have has kind of created a wave of or movement that we try to push forward. And the reason why I think that Maureen and I are involved in this at this stage primarily relates to a point that Maureen raised earlier, where the small and developing states grouping has always been challenged with issues related to this around the gross domestic product or gross national income and the classification of same, and the access to resources that our small islands have, whether it's to get grants, fellowships, funding for infrastructure, etc. Because not simply because your income divided by your population, which is what gross the GNI is, which is as straightforward as it sounds, that measure is very inequitable. Because as Maureen indicated, most of the money that is earned in Cook Islands is shipped out of the Cook Islands. Even though it's earned in the Cook Islands, it doesn't spend there. In Trinidad and Tobago, our oil and gas revenue, which you see there, is not as well not earned by, well, primarily by the local companies. It's we have large multinational operators. You may be familiar with the name BP or Shell, or those large organizations, and they don't, a barrel of oil or natural gas is not sold and the money doesn't arrive in Trinidad and Tobago. We do tax the companies and you get the taxation, but the money is really shipped off of the island. So, and this is, and we are actually two of the island or countries, I should call us, that are more, I guess, well off than others. They're significantly poorer countries, both in the Caribbean. You may be familiar with something called a country called Haiti, which is extremely poor. In fact, it's one of the world's poorest countries. And in the Pacific, they are very small, also poor countries with populations even smaller than Maureen's Cook Island, 17,000. I think Nui, it's 5,000 people, if I'm not mistaken. All of us are affected by or impacted, as Maureen has indicated in the first slide, or slide before this, I think, by things like natural disasters. And nothing like that is taken up in the discussion about gross national income, because in one day, in some cases in 1 hour in Haiti, in minutes, your economy can be wiped out by an earthquake or by a hurricane or a tropical cyclone, as it may be called in the Pacific, or some type of other natural disaster. And of course, climate change impacts all of us in the island economies: rising sea levels, flooding, destruction of the agricultural land, and simply access to resources, full stop. We did attempt to cover these issues and bring them into the internet economy discussion and internet governance, starting from, as Maureen has very nicely done here, 2012 in Baku, not as DC SIDS, but as a sort of a loose aggregation of small island developing states, topic-wise. We're not limited to ourselves, so we invited everyone to join us in this discussion. And we started that discussion then in Baku, Azerbaijan at the IGF in 2012. And every year, as you see, every year since then, we've been very successfully hosting an event at an IGF, although, as I would say, battling the competition of other workshops and other organizers. And we decided, as you see, we shifted to a roundtable model in 2014. It was very, in fact, I don't know, just for your information, that roundtable model was taken up by the IGF as a model to be used for other workshops. They thought our model was so successful that they used it for other workshops. When we moved forward with this concept and realized that we were competing for workshops at the IGF, the advice received was, well, you need to have some sort of probably cohesive and more sustainable structure that will allow this movement to continue without having to battle and compete on topics with others. And that helped us drive the formation of the Dynamic Coalition of Small and Developing States in the Internet Economy. So Maureen and I sat, worked this thing out. We spent, I remember it very well, a Google Doc, overnights and emails, working in different time zones, getting this done, submitted it, and got approved. Of course, there's a lot of work background before that. I don't want to bore you with all that information. But we got that approved, and we had our first workshop in 2018 at the IGF in Paris, France. It was a very significant IGF where that had the Paris Peace Forum and the event. I can't remember the name of the event, but it was a very significant IGF, and we had our first DC SIDS event there, quite successful. And since then, we've had at every IGF since 2018 a DC SIDS workshop or round table, as the case may be. Next slide. Maureen, is this something that we want to jump in together on? So I could start by stating that the way the DC SIDS will operate, or the intention of the Dynamic Coalition really is the idea is not so much to have a workshop at an IGF, and disseminate knowledge and so on. That's what other workshops do. Our real purpose is to provide a forum for small and developing states to engage on the important issues relating to their countries and their regions in the internet economy, specifically related to internet governance, but we could take it broader than that. As you see here, there are approximately 50 plus, depending on who you ask, small and developing states. 55 is a figure that has been bandied about often, but it depends if you count Puerto Rico, Singapore, and so on. And what this does is really gives us the opportunity with a formal structure to engage with not just other countries in the regions, Caribbean, Pacific, and the Ames region, which is Africa and Indian Ocean and Mediterranean, which is another grouping, another ocean, basically, where there are many islands like Madagascar and Comoros, Seychelles, and so on. Reaching out to other networks who are interested in small and developing state issues. For example, with the Pacific, we know Australia and New Zealand, who are themselves islands, not small, but they're also islands, believe it or not, if you're not aware. Engaging with what they're doing in that part of the world and trying to establish if there's any assistance that they can provide to the DC SIDS and engage with them. In the Caribbean, which is on the other side of the world, as I said, we are much closer to North America and South America. So we have two large continents. They're islands in a way, if you think about it from that angle, but they're still continents in the, they're land masses that are not necessarily, they're connected to each other. And we sit between North and South America. So for Glenn, who I know is your CIO for the VSIG, Glenn is from Canada, North America. He sits on top of us, literally, the north of the Caribbean. Trinidad and Tobago sits right off the coast of Venezuela, which is right kissing distance from Latin America. Just give me a second, there's a vehicle driving. Sorry about that. And our objective is to share experiences, interests, and concerns about what impacts our region and our nations. One of the things that is interesting is that the virtual IGF that was held last year was not new to us. The majority of our meetings, but just by definition, need to be virtual because small and developing states are generally scattered. The Pacific in particular, as Maureen would have hinted, just from her own country, which is already scattered in a country, far less the entire region, to get from their countries to get to an event, a physical event, not only takes time, but also takes a lot of money. So for these territories who are not wealthy, to find individuals, these are small territories, just remember, so as Maureen and I know too well, one person does a lot of things as opposed to other countries. Getting from that territory to another territory, to an IGF where it's been held in Egypt or Berlin or France, very difficult, very expensive. So virtual meetings are in fact where we rest our hats anyhow. And we did see a large pickup at the virtual IGF in 2020 that encouraged more participation and engagement from the small and developing states because we're all in virtual mode already. And what we like to do, obviously, given that we've seen success in that model, is to encourage further remote participation and virtual cooperation as we go forward on this. And maybe Maureen, I could toss back to you so you can continue this this piece of the element.
Yeah,
presentation.
thank you. I'll just have the next slide. I think we probably covered some of the next slide anyway. Please. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so one of the things that's really important is that, of course, everyone in DC SIDS, because of the nature of the organisations that belong, that sort of are associated with us, are all volunteers, and so that's one of the reasons why the organisation of it is actually sort of like quite informal, and also, although we don't have any sort of like specific outputs at the moment, although this is the way that we're actually sort of like planning on going, is setting a little bit more direction. Most of our our meetings to date have actually been more on just finding out what's happening within the regions and gathering sort of like what's important, so that we can actually start to sort of prioritize what we might be able to work on together as a dynamic coalition. And I think that just moving over to our achievements, for example, one of the things that I feel has been really quite significant for us is the fact that we were able to, as Tracey mentioned, that we were actually able to create a dynamic coalition and be part of the IGF without having to battle for for recognition that we felt that we're battling against other hundreds of other applicants. So it was a significant achievement to actually become a dynamic coalition and to sort of like be able to attend as of right, and to be able to get the support that we've been able to get from our members to be part of it. And I think that if you've attended any of our global meetings at the global IGF, for example, we've just been amazed by not only the members from within our coalition, but I mean, as you can see, we've got Wakas from Pakistan, and other people who come along to our sessions because they're interested in what we're doing and they're supporting what we're doing. And I think that has been, and I think too, it's the fact that these people who come along are also, they're part of the volunteer sort of system that we're all part of, and that's what makes DC SIDS special, because not only are we working with it with our own members, but we know we've got a really good support system from within the ISOC community and within the ICANN community, and everyone sort of like helping us sort of like grow and just be, just like hopefully have an impact on how as Tracey said, we want to make an impact. We want to make things work for our region, and there's quite a lot happening as we meant to sort of like tell you about as well. But again, because it's volunteer driven, most of the funding that's ever used for any of our events comes from grants, we don't have any sort of like rich sort of like sponsor. It's something that we could really hope to get sometime, Tracey. But and I really do value the work that is actually done by our volunteers and basically all the organisations that I belong to, and we all belong to. And so it's really, we're working, small steps at a time. But we've got a plan, haven't we? Haven't we, Tracey? Oh, okay. So moving on to the next slide, and that sort of like moves into my own experiences in the Pacific region. And really, I mean, like looking at this situation within the Cook Islands, we were very, very fortunate that during this COVID thing, that we sort of like closed our borders pretty soon, pretty quickly, and we didn't have any visitors for 15 months. And we were COVID free, but at the same time, although we were COVID free, we weren't not affected by its influence, especially in regards to our preparedness should our borders be breached. And as I mentioned before, so very recently, we did have like last week, we did have someone who had not identified that they had a positive swab, and had, although they'd done the 2 weeks, they were supposed to identify on the entry forms that whether they had ever had COVID. He didn't identify that and was fined. But I had in February 2020, I had actually been and attended the Apricot meeting in Melbourne, and in February, we were quite surprised that the Apricot meeting wasn't cancelled, because although it still happened, flights to Melbourne from China or Hong Kong were cancelled. So we didn't have anyone from China and Hong Kong unless they were in Melbourne before the closure. And when I returned to Rarotonga in the middle of March, I was on the second to last flight before they closed the airport. And even then I was told I had to, because I'd come from New Zealand, I had to do 2 weeks of lockdown. And before I was allowed to be released from lockdown, I had to return a negative swab. So we had tourists on my flight, and they spent 2 weeks of lockdown. And even though they were in a nice hotel, they didn't get to see much. But during the time that I had been away, that February, March, I realised a lot of work had taken place to really make sure that there were lots of protective mechanisms to ensure that we could keep people safe on the island. Social media and mobile messaging became the norm for communicating information to people on the island. And I mean, we don't have too many people who've actually got internet connections to their homes, but just about everybody has a mobile phone. And I mean, and we're talking like from youngsters to the elderly. So it was pretty. It was sort of like a good way of getting the messages about how systems were working, how people had to look after themselves, and that kind of thing. So While I was on lockdown for 2 weeks, I had regular calls to check that I was okay. If I needed shopping done, or they came in person to check a couple of times a week. It was a really good sort of like way of keeping people safe during the pandemic, even though there wasn't any known cases. Schools were closed, but again, as I said, because not very many people had internet at their homes, that was a major challenge educating students. So I have to say, honestly, that there were some students who were without the internet, and they simply had an extended holiday, because schools didn't have the additional funding for resourcing to support individual learning needs, which was really not very satisfactory. But at the same time, supporting families was important to the government, so that there were subsidies to help keep essential businesses operating, as well as subsidies which they gave for householders with their power bills and phone bills, especially if people lost their jobs because businesses closed. Like without any income, it was a real drain on the government's purse. And for them, their main goal was to keep our population safe and free from COVID, which we have been. And of course, as I mentioned, in May of this year, mid-May, New Zealand and Cook Islands they were talking for about 6 months about when they were going to open the bubble, and they were almost going to open it earlier. And then there was a breakout in New Zealand, so that was it. The border was closed again, but nevertheless, even though with the borders open, I think just about everyone on Rarotonga has had or is due to have very shortly their second vaccination shots. I'm in New Zealand at the moment, and I left just while they were getting the first shots. So I've had my first vaccination shot in New Zealand, and I'll have my second shot at the end of the month before I return to Rarotonga. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we're looking at PICISOC, which is the sort of like the regional organisation that really sort of like coordinates a lot of what is happening across the Pacific region at the user level. And so we've got a membership of about, I think it's about 600. And they're spread across the 22, I don't think every country in the Pacific has got members, but I would say most of them have. But in 2020, and this was a sort of like a breakdown of the sorts of things that we were doing. It was sort of like, because we had everyone was stuck at home. We were actually sort of like able to sort of like do more, because as Tracey said, most of our communication is virtual anyway. So it gave us an opportunity to sort of like establish a whole lot of new groups, working groups and that kind of stuff. And I think that really sort of like helped to, it's really generated a lot more interest within the Pacific. In sort of like further developments which are happening at the moment. But it was really good when people sort of like took on establishing, like we really got the women in ICT group going. The Itala Noa, which Will Tibbin, who was a former PICISOC board member and lecturer at Wollongong University in Australia, have been very interested in the Pacific. And the Talanoa is a Samoan sort of like community meeting where they would talk out issues and things like that. So Talanoa was an excellent sort of like virtual discussion thing that they set up, and that's still happening. But there were lots of things that we were actually involved in, and more particularly getting, when we were in Apricot in Melbourne in February, we were going to hold the APTLD annual general meeting in Fiji in sort of like September 2020. But of course, with the COVID thing, that was sort of like cancelled, and they transferred it to this year, hoping that in September this year we would be able to hold the APTLD meeting in Fiji. And we also planned that we would do the Pacific IGF at the same time. But of course, Fiji's had another sort of like outbreak, and so there's going to be it's going to be virtual, but with some hubs. But I think one of the most interesting sort of like things that happened last year was Professor Hillman Chon from Korea was writing a book about the internet in 2020, internet development in 2020, and he wanted something about the Pacific. And we had a sort of like a special kind of group on our board at the time, and everyone was doing something different, like, I mean, changing jobs, getting into a new area within the Pacific that really added value to what what they could bring to the Pacific. And everyone on the board from last year continues either on this year's board or is actually doing some really amazing things within the Pacific. And I just sort of like felt it was really it was an opportunity to be able to say what what is actually being done and people who are making a difference within the Pacific. And so that book is coming out, and we should get a copy of it very shortly from the professor. Okay, so that's PICISOC 2020. Next, in the next slide, just looking at what they're doing this year, and the most that we're working on with is, of course, the Pacific IGF, and working in collaboration with APTLD and the Asia Pacific Top Level Domain Organisation, as well as Internet New Zealand. They've been very, very helpful to us, and APNIC within our RIR. Oh gosh, I shouldn't be using these acronyms, should I? I've forgotten what that means anyway, but it is the registry service within the Asia Pacific region, which distributes the IP addresses, that kind of stuff. But because this has actually been sort of like quite a time-consuming activity for us, with how we're going to coordinate all the hubs and that kind of stuff, other activities have been fairly limited to like what is happening at national level. And the two sort of like areas that they've actually done provide sponsorship for were for Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, which has been really good as well. But I think moving on to the next slide is the main sort of like organisation that is at government level, which is really important for us, is the Pacific Islands Forum. And one of the oh dear, sorry, I'm just losing stuff here. Sorry, I've lost Zoom. Oh, hang on. There it is. Okay, sorry, I just lost that slide for a second. And so Pacific Island Forum is an organisation that actually coordinates all the governments of the Pacific into a forum which meets so many times a year, and they discuss a lot of issues that actually concern the Pacific. And they're working under a framework of Pacific regionalism, which covers areas that are actually under the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. it makes sense, I guess, that when we talk about continents and large areas, sort of where large countries and that groups of countries in a continent, we've got groups of countries within a big, large ocean, and so this is the strategy for the Pacific, and covering areas like sustainable finance, climate change, cybersecurity, sorts of things, the sorts of things that are of concern to us in the Pacific. Next slide, please. And of course, one of the things that's so that regional development, as proposed by the regionalism framework, has been enhanced by this network, this mesh of cables, fiber optic cables, connecting countries that little dots in the ocean, far-flung places in the Pacific, and connecting them to fast speed internet. The red line that you can see at the bottom right of that map, actually with a little spur right in the middle there, that's where Rarotonga is. That's where the Cook Islands is, and Rarotonga is on the main line, and the spur goes to an island called Aitutaki, which is basically the jewel in the crown. Really, it's quite a pretty island, and it's got the most beautiful lagoon. Everything, it's really lovely. So that's why, because it's got high interest level for tourism, it's one of the reasons why it's actually sort of like got it's been given its own connection to this loop, but in support of this enhanced interest in tourism, online trade, and economic growth, there's been more cable development happening throughout the Pacific. And if we have the next slide, please. And this gives you an idea of all the cables. I mean, that's not all the cables. That's just the cables from 2000 to 2022. But if you wanted to sort of have a look at finding out where these countries are and actually plotting the different cables and where they go to, and it's sort of like making a real network of cables connecting each other on their lines, but also creating that network of fast speed right through the Pacific. So there's been a lot of activity since then, and they all sort of like connecting the smaller islands with the fiber endpoints, which are usually New Zealand, Australia, and Hawaii, and the mainland of the United States. So it's but it's trying to make sure that we get as many islands as possible engaged in it, and the forum has been very sort of like instrumental in making sure that this network is in place, because they have things that they want to do. They want to sort of like enhance within the Pacific. So next slide, please. So one of the I think it's getting back to why the forum is interested in using the power of this connectivity across the Pacific. And this is what's actually happening right at the moment is an e-commerce initiative which they're supporting as a means of encouraging sustainable financing within the Pacific and within the global markets. There's even been a partnership agreement signed between the members of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states, along with the European Union, which was signed in April 2020. And one of the key priorities of this partnership is inclusive, sustainable economic growth and development. And to this end, since the beginning of the year, consultants have been conducting readiness assessments and stakeholder meetings to develop key recommendations and key entities to implement their roadmap plan. And of concern to us in the internet economy are two specific recommendations that have been made in relation to strategic output 1.3, which wants the Pacific region potential for e-commerce to be recognised internationally. And there's two things that they've actually sort of like got in there. The first one is to establish a .Pacific sponsored top-level domain for businesses, organisations, and individuals from the regions to be under an umbrella of a top-level domain .Pacific. And the second thing is to launch a Pacific e-commerce portal, which supports companies to operate e-businesses, as well as to support public and private sectors to leverage the regional partnership. And I think at one stage it was sort of like discussed, I think in the meeting that was held, that it would be something like a mini Alibaba, where all the different companies could be under a particular e-commerce portal. And the whole thing too is developing economy and within the Pacific. So next slide, please. So then, so while we're looking forward to what could be, there are still challenges existing at the present. All Forum Island countries are not the same. They're all at different levels of e-trade readiness with respect to national legislation, policies, ICT infrastructure, and logistics. So, because we've got large countries like Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, they're large. I mean, there is almost. I think Papua New Guinea must be as big as some of the large countries within the Caribbean islands I'm talking about. But there's I think it's about 5 million people in Papua New Guinea, and then again you've got Niue, 5,000 people. So and everyone's still like really different. Looking at their size and everything, but to be able to work effectively on an online platform and system, you have to have appropriate infrastructure, and that is sadly lacking on many of our islands. Cook Islands being the case in point, and the main reason is actually poor last mile logistics. And this is where public-private partnerships should be encouraged in order to prevent further loans. I mean, the Pacific is known for getting loans and getting themselves into debt and not being able to pay it. And I mean, losing property on the island, that having to pay back. It's really, it's just so common that they get, in order to get themselves out of debt, one thing they create other debt. But in order for e-commerce to be effective, trade logistics must also be in place. At the moment in the Cook Islands, shipping services are so erratic, and we've got these islands, these outer islands, who Palmerston, for example, doesn't see a ship for about 3 to 6 months. I mean, so they're running short of supplies. Tough. Air freight is hugely expensive just between the islands in the Cook Islands, and more so if you have a parcel that somebody's ordered and you have to send it overseas. On some of the larger islands in the Pacific, there's still issues with regards to road transport, getting goods to and from rural areas where access is a problem. And this creates a lot of difficulties for suppliers as well as buyers. And the biggest difficulty is trying to pay for anything within the Pacific with the different currencies and banks not accepting funds from other Pacific nations. So, many companies, who are running successful businesses online already have their money in banks in New Zealand or Australia or even the States. So the money's not circulating on the islands. But these issues are being, have been discussed, and there are recommendations that have been made, within the by the consultants and from these stakeholder meetings. And there's going to be a special stakeholder workshop that's going to be taking place in July, where all the groups can get together and have a look at the final presentation before it's made to the Pacific Forum members themselves. So, I mean, for us, that is a major, sort of like development that's going to be helping, and which will really help the Pacific to grow. Now I'm going to turn you back to Tracey, who's going to tell you about the Caribbean situation. And then he can end our session with some of the goals that we're setting for DC SIDS for the next year or so as well. Thank you, Tracey.
Thank you, Maureen. And basically, almost everything that you've said is almost 100% applicable to the Caribbean as well. The issues with last mile connectivity, the issues with the challenges with regional integration and trade, the challenges with general infrastructure within the countries, and of course between, as you can see on the slide. This is our little archipelago, which is not as widespread as the Pacific, and just above the Bahamas. If you can look, if Glenn just mouses over the Bahamas to the top, that little pointy thing there is Miami and Florida, and so just right there. And then you come down, as you can see, Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I'm from, is right on the coast of South America, and that's our sphere of influence. We're just tiny little dots in between these large, monstrous countries, except of course for Cuba, which is well known for many things, and Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which is actually one island split into two, which I think is similar to Papua New Guinea, which has a split island concept. One part being owned by Indonesia, and the other one I think is independent. So Haiti and the Dominican Republic on one island, and when you fly over this island, the border is so distinct because on one side of the island, it's brown and very agriculture has been terrible, what you call slash and burn and destroying the landscape, etc. Whereas as you look at the Dominican Republic and you fly over in an aircraft, it's lush and green and heavily forested. And the border is so clearly distinct, it's almost frightening. The issues that we have in this part of the world, very similar. As you can see, we have to connect each other. Trinidad and Tobago, it's not as many islands as Cook Islands, but there are two islands. There are also a few small islands, but they're not very well inhabited. But we are two fully inhabited islands, Trinidad being the larger of the two, Tobago being much smaller. And just connectivity between our two islands for a long time was done by microwave link, just to get any connectivity, telephone, and certainly internet. Only very recently there was a fiber being placed between the two islands. And our connectivity, even though we're at the bottom there, Venezuela, the majority of our connectivity does not come through South America, as you might suspect. It actually is from Miami. So fibers run from North America straight through the Caribbean Sea, as you see there, and ends in Trinidad and Tobago. Luckily for most of the islands in the region, because it's coming from the Americas and trying to get to South America, we're on the way. So many people are interested in placing fiber from South America to North America. However, the cost is expensive, and within each of the islands, they're quite distinct. Some are much smaller than others, with terrible topography, meaning the geography is very hilly and mountainous. Some of you may have heard that one of the islands, St. Vincent, there's been an erupting volcano on that island over the last month or two. So Montserrat, for example, on that island, you can see labeled there, half of the island is uninhabitable because a volcano destroyed one half of the island and you can't live on it. So how do you get connectivity in these islands with each of their very difficult geographies and topographies? That's probably the major issue that still exists in the Caribbean, even though depending on who you ask, they think it's solved. But I know for a fact, having worked in the sector and worked in government for a while, in my country, there's several pockets of significant underserved communities by geography, which is I guess the basic one that you could state as being obvious, so rural urban divide, but also in terms of other groups of poverty, so people at risk, young people at risk. So we have a lot of crime, gangs in Trinidad and Tobago, and access and accessibility for those groups are challenged. We also have, if you want to talk about accessibility, the issue about persons with disabilities, still a major issue in many of our countries. Infrastructures is not available for persons with disabilities, far less the technology. So many of the things that we implement never cater for someone who is hearing impaired or is visually impaired, or even the desks that you sit on to access at cyber cafes, they're not able to be elevated or dropped if you're sitting in a wheelchair, those kinds of issues. And even larger than that, and if I look at the bullet points I indicated there, digital inclusion and digital literacy, they're highly intertwined. So one of the things that I'm very passionate about is that digital literacy is not equal to social media. And I think in many of the territories in the Caribbean, and I suspect this may be the case in the Pacific as well, the internet is somehow equal to a WhatsApp message or Facebook, using Facebook or using Instagram. But the internet is much more than that. But when the majority of your population associates the internet with social media or applications like that, they're unaware of what the internet means to them and how they can use it. And maybe Glenn could shift along to the other one. I don't want to spend too much more time because I said most of the stuff that Maureen covered already. In the shift to online learning and remote work, which the pandemic caused, that digital literacy issue was exacerbated exponentially. I don't know what other word to use. So the fact that the literacy levels and digital were limited, as I said, social media governed or was your equivalent issue what the internet is. When they were asked to do something else, use Zoom, use Microsoft Teams, use Jitsi, or use any of those platforms, they don't know how to do it. In some cases, teachers didn't know how to use email, right? So that you have that level. You also had the issue of devices being unavailable, and the governments in the region were not aware. I think for many years, they've been told that the individuals in the Caribbean were well connected and they had devices, but when you would go to online learning, a phone, unfortunately, is not sufficient to allow you to connect to do online learning over and beyond attending a video conference like this or a meeting of this nature. But when you're trying to do work online, do assignments and use collaborative tools, submit work and so on, and have teachers mark them, again, they were not aware of how to use these things, and a lot of effort and work was put into understanding what the gaps were, which was, I guess the pandemic created that catalyst to ensure that people understood what the gaps were and to try and fill those gaps. And of course, not only online learning, but remote work. So in the Caribbean, more so than the Pacific, I would imagine, many of the islands, including the larger islands, were very badly, but very badly affected by COVID-19. So, for example, in my country, in Trinidad and Tobago, we are under a state of emergency. It's a raging third wave of COVID-19 of the pandemic right now. If you do some research on Trinidad and Tobago, you'll see we actually ranked extremely highly. It's not a good thing in the countries that have had the most violent surges in both deaths and cases over the last month or so. And those Reuters and Washington Post figures we feature as red as those countries that are in that hotspot. And the other islands, Guyana's on an island, but they're considered part of the Caribbean. Haiti, Jamaica, the larger islands in particular, Dominican Republic in the very start was one of the islands that was very badly affected by the pandemic. So as we shift to the remote work and online learning, which was something that the pandemic drove, it exposed all of these issues that the internet economy that we keep talking about and evangelizing about exposed. And at least the pandemic created the awareness. But of course, the cost of filling those gaps is astronomical. So you had private sector stepping up with donations. Just today, actually, I was an article in our local newspapers where the United Nations donated 350 computers to the school system, so that as exams are coming up, it's coming to the end of a school year, and as this school year was entirely virtual. Last year was partially virtual because the pandemic started in March. No child went to school this year, went to physical school. But for a full year, I think that's the first time I have children, and their first time ever, they would have never attended a class in a year. And apparently, given the history of this, it's the first time it happened, certainly in the Caribbean, that almost every school in the Caribbean was closed for a year. So they had to do online learning entirely. As I said, remote work also, things that we are involved in. Almost right now, we're all remote. We're all at home and we're working remotely. We also had to look at digital government services, because as people moved home and as the government offices closed, how would you continue to offer services to the population that they needed? So social services, services that were important for things like registration of businesses or obtaining licenses and so on. How do you do that in an environment where the physical places are closed? And in many Caribbean islands, digital government, or e-government as it was called previously, was not on the priority list for governments. So what we saw in the Caribbean was the acceleration of digital government and the pushing forward of electronic services and digital services, which I guess, again, is another unintended but potential positive consequence of the pandemic. We also saw the take-up of digital entrepreneurship and digital commerce. So as the restaurants closed and as supermarkets, shopping malls closed, and etc., as the economy shut down, they had to find a way to stay active. So we saw the emergence of e-commerce, which was something that we all know exists and has been in existence for many years and around the world. But in the Caribbean, it's still pretty much a face-to-face, touch and feel service. But we didn't have that. So we had to very quickly pivot into this digital commerce model. And we saw the rise of digital entrepreneurship. So the entire delivery economy, which you may be aware of, which is this, delivering food and goods and services, started to emerge. Companies were established just doing that alone. So not only did the businesses who had that e-commerce storefront do it themselves, there were third parties that were established to earn revenue, and in transaction fees, and all these things were set up. We also saw the rise of digital health. So obviously, as you are at home, how do you receive healthcare? Besides emergency healthcare, your private doctors and so on were closed. Pharmacies were reduced hours. As a matter of fact, if you went out, you risked getting COVID. So is there a way to do this without having to physically attend a physical space? So digital health services, which is the area that I'm working in right now, has exploded in the Caribbean. And one of the things that I think it may also be happening in the Pacific, I'm not too sure, maybe Maureen could clarify, is the concept of digital nomads. And she mentioned the tourism issue already. So many of the islands in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago not being one of those islands, except our sister country, Tobago, sister island, sorry, our economy is not dominated by tourism, but the majority of the Caribbean is. In fact, I think we're the only island in the Caribbean, if I'm not mistaken, where our economy is not over 50%, or at least the majority of revenue comes in from tourism. So even a large country like Jamaica, which has bauxite and other industrial sectors, they still depend on tourism for foreign exchange. How do you operate in a pandemic where no one is flying into your country? And even if they're flying in, as you said, they have to quarantine for X number of days, and be not come out in the economy. You have to stay in your hotel to a large extent. You can't come out and consume goods and services, which is what drives the tourism economy. So creative measures were implemented. This concept of digital nomads. We saw the several of the islands, Barbados being the first, and others following suit thereafter, creating the concept of, well, if you're willing to pay for a certain, depending on the word they use, a stamp or a visa, you can fly to our country, live there, and work remotely with other countries. So if you are from, let's name a large company, if you're working with Google in San Francisco, they're right now still working from home. And if you can, you can fly to Barbados or to Antigua or any of the islands that offer this facility, pay for this this stamp or visa, and operate as if you were in the United States, but you have access to beaches and almost a lifestyle that you as if you're on holiday. So that's one of the things that the Caribbean islands are tending to offer, and quite successfully, I understand. Although my personal opinion on this, and I've written an article on this, is that if you're doing this as a country, it's very short-sighted to look only at the revenue that you earn from the stamp or the visa, and maybe a few dollars from renting an apartment or renting a house or renting a car, and buying food in the supermarkets. The real challenge is to look for sustainability through this. If you have digital nomads coming in your island, how can they build your digital economy? How can they contribute to knowledge transfer to your own citizens? And governments, unfortunately, have not looked at that as a way forward in driving this opportunity that the pandemic presented. So the pandemic has both large impacts, as I indicated, but there are also positive sides to it. I think we'll be forever changed by what happened during the pandemic. And with all due respect to people who have perished, who have passed away and who have been ill and will still be ill after this pandemic passes, we may have changed for the good. And that is one thing that we could see coming out of this. Next slide, Glenn. And like Maureen, the Caribbean operates with a regional focus as well. So she mentioned the Pacific Islands Forum. We have something called the Caribbean Community, which is very similar. The grouping of governments in the Caribbean operate as not as a full economy, but they would love to create a single economic space. Right now, there's a single market space that you can move freely through the region, not as freely as Europe, but certainly more freely than you might expect, for skills to move freely through the region. But specifically to what we're discussing today, the Caribbean region has been trying to establish for some time now a single ICT space, or will be called single digital space, I assume, shortly. What is that? And as I state here, it's an ecosystem of regionally harmonized policies, legislation, regulations, standards, best practices, networks, and services that will allow the bedrock or the foundation for the Caribbean to engage and operate as a single space. So it's almost the companion to the single economy or the single market. That at the same time you have the economic integration, the market integration, digital skills, free movement of skills. You just add tap digital onto all of those. So digital economy, digital skills. And if I'm operating in Barbados or in Trinidad and Tobago or in Haiti or wherever I'm operating from, I can freely operate in another Caribbean country without having any issue or in terms of where I'm from, taxation. I operate as a Caribbean citizens. That's what single ICT space tends to focus on, as well as other issues related to cultural and social engagement and cooperation. So that will require, if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, in addition to the regionally harmonized regulations and rules and policies and laws, also a robust national regional broadband infrastructure. So in the region, each island, of course, like in the Pacific, I would imagine, will have its own connection to the global internet in whatever form or fashion. What we're talking about here is connecting the islands themselves and finding a way to share that broadband infrastructure. And on top of that sharing of broadband infrastructure, perhaps sharing of services. So for example, one of the islands could be a data hub for others. So we could divvy up the work. So for those who are familiar with the concept of resiliency and redundancy, if you're looking at this particular slide and you can see so many names there, I could have a data center in Jamaica, right, which is just about the middle of that Caribbean Telecommunications Union and another regional organization. But I could be operating my data from another country, so I could have my hosted websites, hosted applications. If let's say I'm in British Virgin Islands, but I don't have to host in the US or Canada or other territories. So we have developed centers of excellence for certain areas: cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, robotics, any of those emerging areas that the Caribbean would like to get themselves involved in. As well, the Caribbean also looks to establish nearshoring. For those who don't know what nearshoring is the offering of services to countries that are very close to your shores. So, and as opposed to offshoring, which is further away. So an offshore example would be India offering services to the US. That's an offshore environment. So those familiar with the India model, India sells software development services to companies in the US and other countries in the world. But in a nearshore environment, as you see how close the Caribbean is to the United States, as an example, a Jamaica, which is already happening with contact centers, can sell services to companies in the United States. And the reason for nearshoring, it means that the time zones are similar, and to a large extent, the language differences that you would obtain in, for example, Latin America, or even in India, would not be as impactful. For those who are familiar with the US system, and you call a contact center, you may be familiar with hearing the heavy accents of Asian, I don't know if you call any country name in particular, but Asian operators, contact center agents using that service, and sometimes it's very hard to understand and hear them and work with them. Also common frameworks for governments, ICT service providers and consumers. And as I said before, the characteristic of having effective, secure technology and management systems like the resilient and redundant environment we talk about. Next slide. So I think, Maureen, this is where you would also jump in as well. So I'm just going to start off and maybe you can pop back in. So really and truly, we are in 2021, 2022, given everything that's going on, obviously, with the pandemic and so on, trying to balance the concept of, trying to understand what's happening with our members in the small and developing states within our regions. How can we help? How can we support what they're doing? As for many people, as Maureen indicated, we are all volunteers. So how do we work within our professional lives and our family lives to also support what's happening for our own countries in this space? There is power and strength in numbers. So we do hope that not only within the Caribbean or Pacific and specifically, but also as an entire small and developing states community, we can work together to address and identify any maybe their similarities or their synergies or problems that we can identify that we can solve together. And in doing that, we can build a working plan, a working agenda for going forward, because I think what the pandemic has proven to us is that while we consider our own individual problems in the region, and our own islands, it probably is better and more effective and certainly more efficient to work together as a collective group, use the DC SIDS platform, which is basically virtual, to obtain learnings and best practices from our colleagues from the various regions within the small developing states, including our colleagues and friends who are joining us, because we're not limited only to SIDS. As we said before, in the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand are very happy to work along with us and are members of the DC SIDS. In our part of the world, United States and Canada and Latin America, countries, South America, Central America, very happy to work along with us. I'm sure in the Pacific region as well, there'll be Asian countries who will be willing to work. So we can learn from what's going on in those territories, in those countries, perhaps get support from them and build our platform. One of the things that came out of our most recent meeting at the virtual IGF in 2021, which is something that was actually said in 2020 at the 2019 IGF in Berlin. We do need to build a best practice or a knowledge base for what's going on in the DC SIDS. It's hard work, it's not sexy work, but it's something that it's what we call ugly work, just getting that work done. What is going on, what's happening, and how can we use that learning to drive our communities forward, our countries forward, and the SIDS community as a whole forward. There are not many areas in where this can happen for this specific area of internet, digital, and internet governance. There are SIDS alliances around the world, in the UN system as well, but they're focused on economic issues primarily and climate change issues, right? And that is extremely important. We understand that, but we do need a special focus as well on the digital and ICT side of it and the internet side of it. And we believe that the digital DC SID, is that potential platform where we can work within the UN ecosystem, which is a very powerful, as many of you know, partner to have at the United Nations level, to drive our decisions forward. And by organizing in this way and having the collective voice of 55 plus countries and hundreds of members, individual members and volunteers, we believe we can press forward. So Maureen, I think I'll hand back to you so that you can also add your thoughts on the way forward and the platform going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, just the next, I think, going to the final slide, and I think that what you've actually sort of said expresses a lot of what's here already. Like getting more involved, and I mean there are so many IGF organisations that exist. The dynamic coalitions are just like one of them. And so, there are other ways in which we can be a little bit more inclusive and get involved with others as well. And I guess it's not unlike the fact that, for example, how the DC of accessibility, for example, is sort of like can be part of a whole lot of different organisations and definitely part of ours. And also with regards to enhancing communication. We were sort of like mentioning earlier that the fact that we've got MAG members, and like we need to sort of like make more contact, have more contact and input from them, so that our members can provide their own feedback into the MAG system. But we were actually also looking at like having as other DCs are trying to get their own DC page, and so that we can, within the IGF system itself, so that we've got a repository for putting all our information together in one sort of space. So, I mean, these are some of the things that we're going to be working on and working with others as part of our the collective DC coordination group that we've got. Is that we're all working together to try and make sure that our DCs are effective, within our own communities, but also within the IGF community as well. So I know, like we've just used up all the time, back to you, Glenn. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, you're right. But there's a number of questions I have, and if we can stay for a couple of extra minutes. Maureen, you guys are looking at the top level domain .pacific, similar to .africa. Has that been rolled out yet?
No. Well, the thing is, no. Actually, I raised it in one of the very early consultation meetings, and as a suggestion, and it was taken up as and put into the plan that they're going to present to the forum. So I have also explained to them that I'm not quite sure what the process is in between rounds, for example. But at the same time, there's a lot of preparation that needs to be done. But it really captured the sort of like the approval of people who were, at the meeting that I actually recommended, suggested that this might be a way forward for creating an umbrella organization, like a top level domain that everyone could engage in and really bring the Pacific together. .Asia is very similar, and I've been working with .Asia for yonks. So bringing that kind of coordination, I think it I think that the Pacific Forum would really go along with it, and also that they own it and can lead it and encourage it, that whole Pacific feeling.
And that would take me over to Tracey. Is there anything with CARICOM looking at a similar kind of top level domain for the Caribbean?
Glenn, so that discussion has sort of drifted in and out of what can happen. The CCTLD community has talked about it as a CCTLD community, whether or not we could look at having something like a .Caribbean or something similar, because Caribbean is quite a long extension. But at the level of the CARICOM Secretariat, which is equivalent to Pacific Islands Forum, it has not really come up as a priority issue. Right now, they said it focused on the single ICT space, and this internet governance aspect may in fact be part of that thinking, but certainly has not really emerged as something that would be top of mind. But I do think maybe the new GTLD program that's coming back again from ICANN, if it does in fact get off the ground in the next year or two, we may see something along those lines, emerge, especially if the plans that they have to market and to engage the underserved regions in this area takes off. Because previously, when we had the last round, it was vaguely discussed, but there was no, as you may know, there was no real engagement with the regions, and of course the cost was prohibitive. So it sort of was briefly discussed as CCTLD community, and then died a natural death.
So staying with you, Tracey, you mentioned data sovereignty as a major issue of concern. Now, I understand that your main pipeline is going through Miami. Any concerns about the American Patriot Act? Because if it's going through US servers, does it, where's your digital sovereignty? That's something that, as a Canadian, all our emails go through Chicago. So I'm well aware of this concept.
Yeah, so I mean, I used to be national CIO in Trinidad and Tobago, so this is something that is very dear to my heart. So just from the standpoint of pure technology, it should not matter and does not matter from a technical standpoint where your data is stored, right? It should not. As a matter of fact, having visited some data centers in different parts of the world, I can't say where they are because of my NDAs with them, but I've visited pretty secure data centers, and I would probably prefer to have my data hosted in those centers rather than something else that I've seen maybe in the Caribbean, as an example. However, as you quite rightly pointed out, if you go to the United States and maybe even other countries in outside of the Caribbean, once you host your data in that country, you are susceptible to the laws of that country. Those laws may or may not be intrusive, right? So if you go to, let's say, Canada, as one example, that may be preferable to hosting it in the United States, where, as you succinctly hinted at there, the Patriot Act gives US government the right to, basically hold your data hostage, at least interrogate what's happening there, depending if they believe that you are operating terrorist activities, money laundering activities, etc., drugs, and so on. So it is a very serious issue. And when I was in that role a few years ago, every vendor that we spoke to, every ICT supplier, large and small, we did try to find a way, and this is prior to the cloud becoming a big thing. So cloud, is now everything is the cloud, right? So cloud was now emerging as a dominant force. So we actually pioneered the concept of separation of data from application. So what we were trying to encourage, I think this is the way to do it. So data classification one, so organizing your environment so that you can understand where what is your most secure data and what can safely be hosted outside of the country. Even beyond that, once you understand that part of it, is there a way for the prospective supplier of the solution that you're getting, whether it be hosting or application, to separate the data and from the application? So we were very busy, and this is again before cloud got more sophisticated, where that is actually possible almost on a snap of a finger now, to separate the data from the application and create what we call hybrid environments. And that's a very common concept now. So you have a hybrid data center concept, which we asked for, a hybrid cloud. And what we were asking for, I think is something that really is important if the Caribbean is to go forward, is while we cannot yet be in the level of a large data center in the United States or Canada or even Latin America in terms of scalability and so on, but certainly we can have the data reside at least on a secondary or primary for those who are technical, maybe the secondary layer, so as a backup site, a hot or cold backup site.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, exactly, and certainly not be relying only on the international locations, and therefore, if something does in fact happen, that the Patriot Act or similar legislation comes into force, you can quickly and very rapidly treat with the issue technically, of course, as well as the other big issue is legislatively, and that could be a whole different discussion about data protection and what that means. But yeah, so it is, long story short, it's a very serious issue that luckily technology is here today to allow it to happen. But then maybe 5 or 10 years ago, it was something that was a huge concern of how to do it technically. But I think that's something that each Caribbean island will have to take note of, and certainly demand that happens now. In addition to, as I said before, becoming their own data economy and building out their own environments within their islands to really get to that stage as quickly as possible. So they can become a center of excellence for data. Singapore has established themselves as one. Malaysia is doing it as well. Why not an island in the Caribbean can do something very similar for its region, if not for the world, certainly for the Caribbean region, maybe for Latin America and the Caribbean. Yeah.
So, Maureen, I'm aware that of what I've read, countries like Samoa, American Samoa, has some of the highest rates for the end users in terms of getting access to the internet. And I'm sure that's not just Samoa, it's most of the islands. And you are dealing with the digital divide. So how are you broaching this issue with the DC Coalition? Are you lobbying for lower rates, or how are you broaching this issue?
Yeah, I guess we have to sort of look at when we're, and I find the PICI, if I wanted to broach that with the Pacific, and I could do that on the email list and sort of say, look, hey, we're talking about this, what would you think would be the best approach to take? And I mean, I guess it's because we've got Anju Mangal, for example, on our board, who the previous board is now part of the Affordable, it's the Alliance of Affordability Alliance. That one? Yeah. And so I mean, and that's the perfect. I mean, she would be the perfect person to sort of like be working on something like that. but we really need to get sort of like feedback from, like, I mean, for example, as you say, like Papua New Guinea has always had, like, I mean, probably 100 times more expensive than anywhere else. With internet connect, and it's always been that way. I think now, like for example, in the Cook Islands, the fact that we've actually we've got a new Telecommunications Act, which has actually opened up the competition, so that we're actually able now to get the rates are actually going down. I've actually sort of like I found that Vodafone, for example, the service of Vodafone was just crap. And so and while we're waiting for fibre, I've actually sort of like invested in my own satellite, which is going through Pacific. And but we never had those opportunities before. So choice makes a difference. And I think that even if we can, I think through the Pacific Forum and this new e-commerce initiative that they're actually sort of like thinking of doing, this is going to encourage more, and that what we'll be talking to and encouraging the Pacific Forum to do is to encourage governments to take more action to make sure that the internet is more affordable.
Tracey, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think it's maybe no. It's a challenging issue. It really is a challenging issue, and I think Maureen covered. As I said before, much of what's going on in the Pacific can be mirrored very, very, very well in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things, maybe what I would add to what Maureen is saying, I don't want to repeat it, is that if and when these solutions are found, or there are best practices that are developed out of the problems that we're solving, we can use the platform to share those how those issues are solved. So if it's an affordable access issue or meaningful connectivity issue, as what the E4I is doing, and Fiji has solved it, or Jamaica has solved it, and there's something that was very transformational that happened, whether it be through legislation, through some magic wand that was waved and it happened. And in some cases, as you know, that I don't know if you're aware of this, that the Caribbean and the Pacific share operators. Digicel is a company that operates in both territory, in both regions. Digicel is an Irish company that operates in the Pacific and the Caribbean. I mean, believe it or not, it's not well known, but it does that, and it seems to specialize in small island states. And if solutions are found, and Digicel, for example, is part of that solution as an example, then the learnings can be shared. So I really do want to make a plug for this, not repeating the problems that we face, but make a plug for the fact that once we find solutions to the problems, that we can share them. And I think this DCCS platform is in fact that. It's a really good opportunity because there's nothing else I'm aware of. I think Maureen could back me up on this, where there's a focus on not just digital, but the internet, right? That is SIDS focused. So it's not just about ICT and the things that you talk about maybe at the broader the broader concepts that they go on these SIDS alliances. This is an internet focused issue, including internet governance issues. And I think this platform is going to be very, very useful if and when we get to that point where PNG solves a problem or Jamaica solves a problem, that we can share that learning.
Now, I assume you guys are going to be holding sessions, whether virtual or hybrid, in Poland in December for the next IGF, or do you have another meeting coming up? Because I think you said you have 2 or 3 meetings a year. Is there another meeting happening before the IGF in Poland?
Well, I know that that's something that we're going to be working on, and I think that before the IGF in Poland, it would be really good, as we are planning, to get the MAG members together and to sort of look at how we can work, to be more effective in our next meeting and in the next IGF. And I guess we're just like fingers crossed to sort of see what happens. with regards to, whether there is going to be even a hybrid meeting and enabling some people to go. I mean, I think that, it's been raised, the whole hybrid thing has been raised about, the fact that some people will be able to go and some people won't. And I mean, I think that that's just the way of the way the world has actually sort of like developed now. There's going to be some people, for example, like as I said about the apricot meeting, China and Hong Kong, all those flights were shut off. There was no way they could get to Australia.
Yeah.
And I mean, that didn't affect the fact that, there was remote participation. They still participated, just not actually face to face. And for some countries, I think that's going to have to continue. It's just the way it is.
The way it is.
And probably what I would say, Glenn, is that so Maureen may not have mentioned this, but I think I'm making a special effort this year to try and participate. And I jumped in a call with them on the Pacific IGF planning.
Yes, you did.
Trying to find a way to to walk the talk, as we say. So not just having these DCSIDS meetings, because this is not something that we can. It's not like a usual. We're not around a topic. This is a very different group. We are doing a lot of things. We're very small countries doing a lot of things to do a lot of, and our times are very challenged, right? But there may be opportunities for us to cross fertilize and collaborate using the existing meetings that we currently have. There may not be a need to have a DCSIDS meeting intersessionally, as an example, because it's going to be difficult to pull one off, quite literally. It's difficult to pull the IGF meeting off in the first place, far less having meetings in between. But why not use the Pacific IGF and the Caribbean IGF, which is coming up as well, to have members sort of cross-fertilize each other's ideas, because again, it's virtual. Nobody's stopping you from joining, right? You can't, there's no travel to say I have to fly to country A, country B. I can hop in a meeting of a meeting that's happening in Fiji, I presume, in spirit, if not in actuality. And similarly, when the Caribbean IGF happens virtually, which there'll be no country it's happening in this year for sure still, then the Pacific Islanders and the Ames Islanders can jump in as well. Sure. And it's entirely possible maybe we can create a marginal DCSIDS meeting out of that. And let's have a virtual meeting after this, this session to touch base on what happened. Use the opportunities that we have, again, that the pandemic has inadvertently brought about, and make it work. Because I think, as I said, there are more pressing issues, I think, to be honest, in each of the territories than to go to a DCSIDS meeting, just to be totally honest with you. I'm battling a pandemic in my own country, and Maureen is trying to figure out how to survive in her country, professionally and so on. Another person is trying to survive, trying to find a way to get out of that country that they may be stuck in. There are things that are happening that there's no luxury to have a DCSIDS meeting to say, let's come and chat about stuff. So I think use the opportunities that are available, that present themselves, and make the best of it. And maybe that might be the way to really make things happen, because you force the collaboration in, and you get the cross-fertilization by having people look at what each other's doing. Yeah. Because I'm looking at the Pacific agenda, and I'm impressed at what they're trying to achieve. And if the Caribbean IGF is also happening, and they might come and say, "Oh, that's what the Caribbean's doing," because we don't really know. We only know by documents, as opposed to actually sitting in the meetings ourselves.
Final comment, Maureen?
Final comment. Well, I must admit, I'm just thrilled with the opportunity to be able to bring a dynamic coalition to your VSIG. Thank you very much for that invitation. And I guess it's the first time Tracey and I have actually had an opportunity to tell people about other than our own communities, of course. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, thank you both so much. The recording will be available, and so the existing group, which meets every Monday, but every single one of our recordings are available, and they're available right across the board. So I'll send you guys the link as soon as it gets live on YouTube. Again, thank you so much for your time. it's a little longer than we expected, but it was an enjoyable time. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Stay safe. Stay safe.